Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
As India approaches another Republic Day, it might be a good moment to think about what that is all about, really, beyond being a long weekend this year. To be honest, as kids in school in India, we had a pretty clear sense of what Independence Day was about. We'd read all about the independence movement in history class. We knew about Jawaharlal Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech. It was part of India's history. Independence Day belonged to the people. Republic Day felt like it belonged to lawyers and solemn people who sat in the Constituent Assembly and had ponderous debates and then produced a very, very long document. But perhaps it's time for people to take the Constitution back, because ultimately laws are not just meant for lawyers. A provocatively titled new book, The Colonial Constitution, looks at how we got the Constitution we did and argues that even though it was framed by the people who got India independence, it was in the end a pretty colonial document. As we head up to Republic Day, we are joined by its author, Arghya Sengupta, Research Director at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. Arghya Sengupta, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sandip. Pleasure to be here.
What many people don't realize about the Constitution, and I actually only dimly knew, was that it's based on something called the Government of India Act 1935. That was sort of the starting point. Can you just bring us up to speed on what was the act and how was it regarded by Indian politicians when it came into effect?
Right. So we have to go back in history a little bit to understand what the Government of India Act 1935 was all about. And that starts with the declaration of Purna Swaraj that the Congress does, that we all know from our history textbooks. And the Congress is demanding Purna Swaraj. The colonial government is not giving it. Instead, we get 3 roundtable conferences to work out the future constitution of India. Those roundtable conferences fail. Congress doesn't attend the first one. Gandhi attends the second one, but there is no consensus. We know that after that, there is a Gandhian impact, but there's a civil disobedience movement that takes off at that point of time. And finally, we get the Ramsay MacDonald Award. The Ramsay MacDonald Award is essentially laying out, in some sense, the future charter of government in India. And then there is a joint committee that is set up in the UK Parliament to draft a so-called constitution for India. And what we get ultimately in 1935 as a result of these 6 years of constant struggle and petition is the Government of India Act. So what does the Government of India Act do? Broadly speaking, it sets out the structure of government both at the level of the union, that is in Delhi, as well as at the level of the provinces. So for the first time, you have some semblance of a federation, number one, which is that there will be provincial governments that will be elected by the people. And then in the center, it will still be the Governor General's Council, but at the same time, they've broad-based that significantly. So the first thing that they do is they set up government in the union level as well as at the provincial level. The second thing that they do is that they reduce the Governor General's powers significantly. As Leo Amery, who was the Secretary of State, said at that point of time, the Governor General is always there as a matter of last resort, but the Governor General will now act in concert with Indian leaders. And broadly, I'm simplifying here a little bit, but broadly speaking, that's the second thing that they do. But there is no talk of rights, there is no talk of dominion status, and there is certainly no talk of Purna Swaraj. So coming to the second part of your question, how do the Indian leaders at that point of time see the Government of India Act? I think it's best described by Nehru, who calls it a charter of slavery, because he said we had asked for independence. Instead, we not get independence, but we got essentially some crumbs of tokenistic representation. Jinnah had pretty much the same view, that they were opposed to the Government of India Act, and it was widely shared across, this view was widely shared across the political spectrum. But when elections were announced under the Government of India Act to the provinces, the Congress party decided, and the others as well, decided to contest those elections. And there's a lot of background, hectic parleying that has gone on in order to make this happen. But the basic idea was that let's try and see if we can get independence from the inside. So that is why in 1937, when elections happen to the provinces, you have provincial governments that come in, which is the first whiff that we have of self-government under colonial rule, even if it is in a very limited form.
So finally, what was the logic then behind using the Government of India Act of 1935 as the base starting point? Was it impractical to start from a clean slate?
Yeah, I think it was expediency. The main reason for using the Government of India Act was that even if something is the charter of slavery when it comes in, the fact is that you worked with it for the last 12 years, as there is a certain degree of familiarity and there's a certain degree of acceptability that it has generated over a period of time. So I think the fundamental reason is that it was there as a draft. The second thing is that we were actually in a hurry to draft the constitution. I work a lot with governments, and the deadline that we get sometimes to draft statutes is do it tomorrow or do it day after tomorrow. And it's no surprise that there were similarly aggressive deadlines for drafting the constitution. India was independent. We were still being governed by a combination of the Government of India Act and the Indian Independence Act. And it was necessary that we have a constitution of our own as soon as possible so that we can declare ourselves a republic. In this matter, I fully agree with what the Constituent Assembly did, is that we couldn't really start on a clean slate because it would really require a lot of background work which had not been done. So the Government of India Act was available, and that is why the Government of India Act was chosen as the base document. And there is a second reason for that. The second reason is that it was the view of the Congress, particularly Gandhi, that the contents of the Constitution don't matter very much, because he said something very interesting, is that if the Constitution is past its time, then a future generation will change it. So we don't need to worry too much about the contents. But for Gandhi, what was critical was the fact that the Constitution generate consensus, that it secure, as he says, justice to all communities. And that's his quote. And the Government of India Act, given the fact that the Muslim League was well aware of its contents, other parties were aware of its contents, Ambedkar was solidly batting for the Government of India Act. In fact, at a point of time, he said that we really don't need to do much. We don't even need a Constituent Assembly. All we need is to set up a small committee and they can just adapt the Government of India Act and make it applicable as the Constitution. So it seemed like the practical choice, actually, at that point of time.
So it sounds like you would have chosen that as the starting point too if you were part of the Constituent Assembly at that time.
This is a real hypothetical, but this is what I try and do with governments, as in I try and push for longer deadlines. And I think that's what we would have done because of the very simple fact that a constitution is a historical moment. And that kind of historical moment doesn't come back very often and shouldn't come very often. And I think that is a time when there is a possibility of radical change. And that change needn't necessarily be a decisive break from the past. As I think these binaries as to whether the Constitution is a continuity document or whether it is a founding moment, as I think these binaries are a bit flawed. I think the Constitution essentially is a moment where you can make transformational change happen. I think it would have been better to certainly take from not only the Government of India Act, but other things that work, but also to ask the fundamental question that what are we looking for in a constitution, rather than the question that the Constituent Assembly framers asked, which was, how can we change the Government of India?
So what would have made the Constitution transformational in your view?
This is a work in progress as far as my own views are concerned. I don't have a fully fleshed out understanding of what kind of constitution would have worked well for India at that point of time. So I will admit that candidly. But I have some broad directions of what could have been more transformational and more authentic in some sense. And one is that I think we needed to think more closely about decentralization. At that point of time, we were in the throes of partition. We felt that secession was a real issue. So I can understand why the need for a strong center and a strong government in New Delhi became an overriding consideration. But the fact of the matter is that we know that no matter how heinous the crimes in partition were, and no matter how difficult law and order situation was, we know that it would pass. And even the framers knew that it would pass sooner rather than later, but the Constitution was here to stay, or one would hope that the Constitution is here to stay. So I think we needed a better balance of power between center, state, and we needed to bring in local government into the mix. I think that's number one. Number two, which I think is a critical factor, is that we needed to think a little bit more about what we wanted to do with colonial institutions. So if I were to give you an example, the Imperial Police Service was responsible for the atrocities of the Raj. Most of our freedom fighters were at the receiving end of it. But when it came to the Constitution, we took a very pragmatic view that we were going to change the name from the Imperial Police Service to the Indian Police Service. This idea of changing names has continued and is of old vintage. But we thought we'll change the name. We'll not only change the name, but we will enshrine it constitutionally as an all India service. We will not reform it in any way. The Indian Police Act of 1861 will also continue because we believed at that point of time that now that the government would be run by Indians, it would be run for Indians. So the police would now magically change their stripes. But we know that it doesn't happen that way. And if we are going to continue colonial institutions, then we should be sure, A, about which institutions we are going to continue. B, we have to be sure about how we are going to continue them. And C, we have to think more closely about how we should reform them.
In fact, you write in the book that it was Ambedkar who, to the surprise of many, was the swing vote when it came to securing preventive detention, securing that into the Constitution. Do we have any sense of why did people who had suffered so much at the hands of police in the Rowlatt Act, why did they do that?
There are two general points and there's one point on Ambedkar that I'd make. So as far as the general point is concerned, I think it was Shankar Rao Deo in the Constituent Assembly, I may be wrong, who said that the drafting committee, with the exception of Kanhaiya Munshi, had never gone to jail. And so they actually didn't know what it was like to face a lot of these police atrocities. And I think that there is something there that, irrespective of that factual premise, the fact of the matter is that the matter of drafting the Constitution was left to the lawyer. And when something is left to the lawyers, you get a kind of status quo that continues because lawyers are naturally a little resistant to radical change. The second, which I think is a key point, is the fact that we were really bothered about partition and law and order at that point of time. And I think it was weighing very heavily on the minds of the framers. And one of the days when they're discussing this preventive detention provision, one of the members says that basically there is a riot in Paharganj and he had to cross over some police pickets before he could make it even into Parliament House. So it's obviously weighing very heavily. As far as Ambedkar is concerned, I think that there is a deeper philosophy at play here. Ambedkar believes in the state over Brahminical society as a protector of liberties of citizens and particularly citizens of the depressed class. That's his fundamental view. So he wants greater powers in the state. And he feels that the Constitution is the right place to do it. So Ambedkar wants to give the state greater powers because he feels that the state can guarantee liberty. Were they being rosy-eyed and optimistic? I think there was a bit of that, and it's natural because, you're in a very heady moment. You've got independence. Everything seems very positive at that point of time. And as students of political theory, we know, and this we certainly know from the framing of the American Constitution, that it's based on a fundamentally different and opposing premise that man is vile, right? That is the premise from which the American Constitution starts, that you have to have human ambition counteract other people's human ambitions. So essentially, you know that people are selfish, people will work for their own good, and so you have to have this system of checks and balance. And I think that there was kind of an optimism of the time that prevented that from happening. We did have some checks and balances in the preventive detention chapter, but I think that overall, it's a constitution that gives very large powers to the state, even when it gives fundamental rights to citizens.
And speaking of the fundamental rights, what in your view then makes it colonial? Is it the fact that it's based on something like the Government of India Act? But wouldn't it be fair to say that while they borrow that infrastructure, they then built a different house on the infrastructure? I mean, in terms of fundamental rights, universal franchise, of course.
Yeah, so I think that, as I said, that there are three things that make it colonial. It's not only about the fundamental rights. One that I've spoken about is the fact that we've continued colonial institutions without changing them, number one. Number two is that we have this long and overly prescriptive constitution, right? Because we say it's the longest constitution in the world, and there is a reason for that. The reason for that is that we believe, and the constitution framers believed at the time, that the people cannot be trusted. The people aren't ready for democracy. As if this is a colonial holdover from the fact that the natives are liars and the natives are not to be trusted. And why?
Wait, Arghya, but then you're saying, are they holding two fundamentally kind of counterintuitive views? At one point, it's rosy-eyed view that people are not vile and will do their best. And at the same time saying people are vile and cannot be trusted.
No, but here there are two different kinds of people that we are talking about. I think there is a rosy-eyed view about the state, certainly, and about holders of public office, because the people you're seeing around you have basically given up their lives for the freedom movement. So you think that when they're going to turn around and now be wielders of sovereign power, they are going to do what is right for India. Okay, and that's the view. But the people, as in the people of India, are not ready for democracy. And so that is why we need to give greater powers to the state, which is now composed of these brilliant individuals, so that they can take these people who are otherwise illiterate and unlettered towards democracy. And there is no shame in admitting this, that there is a certain sense of elitism that permeates a lot of these debates. In fact, T.T. Krishnamacharya, who's otherwise an extremely erudite person, says there's a discussion in relation to emergency powers. He says that civil liberties of citizens, whatever that may be, and I think it's all good intentions. Okay, let's be very clear. But so, as far as democracy is concerned, and Ambedkar has said it himself, as a democracy is only, whatever, it's a topsoil, as in the dressing of India. So we know very much that at that point of time, there is a sentiment that is very strong among the framers, and maybe right as well, that the people haven't experienced democracy. And so we have to be guided gently. And so how does this guidance happen? This guidance happens through the longest constitution in the world, right? Because you're laying down everything as a matter of law. And I think that that also is something that ultimately is based on the view that you're not trusting your people. And so that's the second reason. And the third is that I do think that in the constitution, and this is something that is we are witness to every day, living in India, whether under this government, the previous government, or any other government that we've seen, is that the state towers over the citizen. And I think there is no doubt about that. The fact is that in India, the state is really powerful. And certainly the law and order state is powerful. And so we now tend to think that, if you're calling a constitution colonial, we are in some kind of decolonial moment where we are changing names and we are doing stuff which tries to erase this colonial legacy. But I'd like to remind your listeners that, the first criticism that the constitution was colonial was made by Somnath Lahiri, who was the only member of the Communist Party in the Constituent Assembly, who said that this was a police constable's constitution. It seems that it has been written from the point of view of a police constable. And this is an example that I like to quote because my colleagues from the Vidhi Centre have come up with this after some great deal of hard work, which is that in 2021, there were 58 lakh people who were arrested in India. Arrested means there was some legal process, an FIR, and something the police investigated and arrested some people. In comparison, there were 86.6 lakh people who were detained in India, which means they were simply picked up and put in behind bars without any legal process. Yeah, sure, some of them maybe for 2 days or a week or maybe for short periods of time. But the fact is that there is an overriding sense in this country, and we all feel it, that the state is superior to the citizens, and we are still, though we say it's we the people, we are still supplicants.
But Arghya, would it be fair to think of the towering state as the legacy of colonialism? Because plenty of countries which were never colonized have equally towering states over their citizens, and it seems even in India, even with the spirit of decolonization, that has made the state even more towering.
I mean, there's two questions there. One is the fact that a state can be towering even without the history of colonization. Absolutely. I mean, China is the best example of a towering state that is not colonial. But in India, the fact of the colonial state was towering. And what we continued was that. Now, if you go back further in time, maybe you will find a monarchical state. I mean, and maybe that might be towering too over the citizen.
Yeah,
Maybe
I mean, in India, everything was towering before 1947, wasn't it?
that's right. So you might go back to a situation where essentially you're saying that we are essentially feudal in that sense. And so we're always, as people, looking up to whatever is there on top. It happens to be the state. And so we're doing that. So as an on that, I fully agree with you. But the history of India is such that the so-called, I mean, I wouldn't say so-called, but the democratic state that we have after 1947 is still a work in progress, where we are working towards a better balance of citizens' rights and states' powers. So I think that's the overarching point. And the second point, so I don't think we are at a true moment of decolonization at this point of time. As in, I think we are kind of at decolonization phase 0, which is when we are thinking about it and we are reacting in a particular way, which is kind of at the level of optics, right? So we are changing names of cities, we are changing names of roads, we're thinking about alternative names for the country. We are trying to assert ourselves maybe in foreign policy. So I think this is all kind of the first wave where we are in no way challenging the fundamentals of colonization of a large state. And a good example of this is the recent criminal law reform bills, which are ostensibly to decolonize, but actually are reinforcing many of those colonial ideas. It's a journey. This is my view, that it's a journey, and we will get there, but we are certainly not there now.
But to be fair, of course, Argo, I mean, we can't single out India as feudal. Most countries, most societies were feudal, and, you know, they went through revolution and all of that in order to not be feudal. And the Constitution, as Ambedkar freely admitted, borrowed a lot from French, American, Irish Constitution. And you chronicle in your book how B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor, goes and meets many jurists and judges around the world and solicits their opinion. So in that sense, could we not say that it's more influenced by those at that time Western ideas of modernity rather than colonial?
Let me say what the Constitution is not. The Constitution is not an insular document. It is not only looking within, it is very much looking without and trying to take the best that the world has to offer. And I think that there is a lot, and at that time, as there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that's happening contemporaneously, it's the post-war era where anyway people are thinking that the socialist state is the way forward for generally the future of democratic states. And so I think that there is a lot of not just borrowing, I mean, which is only to be expected, but a lot of positive influence that we get from other places. But I think that there is a general sense that what we are trying to do is we are trying at that point of time to borrow and then Indianize. And this is something that we continue doing even today, that we take best practices from everywhere and try and make them Indian.
Which is fine, no? I mean,
there's nothing wrong with that, but I've always felt that the fundamental question shouldn't be what is being done elsewhere. I mean, we should certainly know what's being done elsewhere, but that's not the fundamental question. And what is being done elsewhere and how do I adapt it to Indian conditions? The fundamental question is that what is the problem we are trying to solve in India? So if I were to give a very simple, it might seem as a provocative example, but I would say that the primary form of dispute resolution in India should be mediation. It should not be litigation in courts. I think that litigation is expensive, it is slow, it is something, most importantly, that people who are the litigants don't understand. If we were to be thinking originally, we needed to think, we can understand what kind of litigational models are there in other parts of the world, as in Supreme Court and High Courts and other lower courts. But we needed to think for ourselves as to why we can't think of mediation as the primary mode of dispute resolution in the country.
Yeah, okay, you say we should have thought, but there were some people thinking at that time, and you chronicle what were some of the alternatives which were not taken that seriously including there is a sort of Gandhian Constitution. Can you explain a little bit about what was in it and why, despite Gandhi's immense stature, that was not taken very seriously by the framers? I mean, I recognize Gandhi is assassinated in 1948, but You could have thought that his assassination would add even more impetus to, celebrate them or memorialize the Mahatma in the Constitution.
So I think the reason why that doesn't happen in 1948 and even like in 1946 is that by that time, Gandhi is no longer interested in constitutional reform in terms of what the Constitution has to offer the country. He's interested in moral uplift of individuals. Most of his constitutional writing happens in Hind Swaraj in 1909, and he continues to talk about it till about the declaration of Purna Swaraj, and then on and off he talks about it. But when it comes to the 1940s, there are two things that he fundamentally focuses on. One, he focuses on what he calls the constructive program as to how we can be better citizens, make sure we are neat and clean, and maintain hygiene and so on and so forth. And the second part that he's focusing on is as far as the Constitution is concerned is that the Constitution should generate consensus. He sees the Constitution as a pragmatic opportunity to get the Muslim League and the Congress and all political parties to sit down and thrash out something that everybody agrees on. Now, this is what he is interested in and not so much the content of the Constitution itself. So this idea of the Gandhian Constitution, and there are two practical manifestations of it. One is that there was a tiny princely state called Aundh in modern-day Maharashtra and Satara, which was a princely state of about 75,000 people, so very, very small, with a Gandhian Maharaja who gave up his powers and had an elected body. It was a bottom-up government, started with local self-government, then some small body at the apex level at the state. There were no courts. There was only one high court judge for some criminal matters, but otherwise there was only kind of local forms of dispute resolution. Broadly speaking, it worked. The second practical manifestation was that a noted Gandhian Shriman Narayan Agarwal, who was later become the governor of Gujarat as he was a congressman, he was also in the Constituent Assembly, had been given the task of writing a so-called Gandhian Constitution. So he came up with this document called Gandhian Constitution for Free India. And there were two major pillars of that, which were different from the Constitution of India. The first was that it was bottom-up government. And by bottom-up government, I mean that people were to directly elect their panchayats. The panchayats would sit together and elect district. Districts would sit together and elect state. And state would sit together and elect center. And center would only have foreign affairs, defense, communications, some very important but limited powers. But most of the powers would be at the village level. That's number one. Number two is that it had the idea of duties much more centrally in the scheme, side by side with rights. So it kind of strikes you as some kind of a moral charter to be good citizens, to do what is told of you. So it kind of, today it strikes someone as preachy. That's how it came across. Gandhi himself realized that. And because Gandhi, as in more than being a constitutionalist, was a pragmatist. So he himself, when he writes the foreword, says that, it has my name, but it doesn't mean I endorse all its contents, because he realizes that it's too radical for the time for something like this to happen. And I agree with that. But that is an idea that even today, 75 years later, needs to be worked on. Because when we are talking about duties, and now the Prime Minister talks about duties a lot, okay, and this is not just this Prime Minister. Indira Gandhi has talked about duties and we put the fundamental duties in the Constitution. Every Prime Minister talks about duties. There is a kind of older Indic idea of duty, dharma, that kind of pervades this or underlies this kind of thinking. And I think that there is some serious work to be done in terms of how duties can coexist with rights. Because if we don't do this work, then we could get into this dangerous situation where, we suddenly find ourselves owing duties to the state. What I'm talking about is civic duties that we owe each other as citizens. Because I genuinely believe that India cannot grow if we look to the state to be our benefactors. We have to be better and nicer towards each other. Maybe living for a long time in Delhi has reinforced this view that we do need this. But it's not that it's much better in Calcutta as well, where you are and where I came from.
You say Gandhi was a pragmatist. So obviously, even a layperson realizing that would worry, if power is bubbling up from the village to the top, does that come from a very dewy-eyed, romanticized notion of the village? That kind of local authority could end up with one village passing certain laws that don't match, 14-year-olds are allowed to get married in this village, but on the other village, it's only 18-year-olds.
Any thought of this kind of radical change is always a bit scary. And we can think of many doomsday scenarios. This has always been the kind of stock argument of lawyers arguing for status quo. Okay, to paint some doomsday scenario and say that this is not going to happen. I could also say that what will happen is actually that the villages will find that they really like each other and there is great concert and they will work together. And you know that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Okay, it's always like that. But you're right. Gandhi does have a slightly dewy-eyed idea of the village. He does have that. And this idea of this self-governing village republic is a mythical idea. And I think Ambedkar's writings had sort of conclusively demolished that thought. But I think where Gandhi's second order point makes a lot of sense, and at least for me, is the fact that even if you were to say that the village is, as Ambedkar said, that it's a cesspool of vice, it's essentially a place where you actually don't want to give any powers, the answer cannot be that you take power away and give it somewhere far off. Because what you're essentially doing is that you're trusting some unnamed bureaucrat somewhere who you don't know, okay? But not the person who you know who's near you. And I'm saying this today, I live in Defense Colony in New Delhi. I shudder at the thought of my Residents Welfare Association being given wide powers, okay? Because I can see the kind of prejudice that the Residents Welfare Association has. I'm part of this I used to be part of this WhatsApp group. But the answer...
Let's hope none of your Residents Welfare Association people are listening to this podcast.
No, they can hear it.
Or maybe they
what
are.
I'm going to say now is that the answer cannot be that take away power from a Residents Welfare Association and give it to some unnamed bureaucrat sitting in the Municipal Corporation of Delhi. The answer has to be that we have to get better people in the Residents Welfare Association, and the good people in the Residents Welfare Association, of which there are many who maintain these parks in my locality very beautifully, as it must be empowered. The answer is let's work with those imperfections and try to change that and make that happen better. That's really what we need to do. And I find that there is a lot of merit in that, because the kind of societal problems that we're talking about, as particularly in relation to caste prejudice, sexism, patriarchy, these are not problems that will go away by writing a constitution, right? I mean, the constitution can help and push us in that direction, but it won't go away. And D.R. Nagaraj, the Kannada author, has a great dialogue, a fictitious dialogue between Gandhi and Ambedkar, where he says that both were right. Both were right. That Gandhi was right because he realized that there has to be some purification that must come from within. But Ambedkar was also right in saying that just because purification must come from within doesn't mean that we have to now wait for this purification to happen. We must also try at the same time to ensure reservations happen and so on. So I think it lies in this kind of harmony between the two rather than painting them as some kind of divergent opposites.
Now, the other constitution that's out there, which I think many of our listeners will not be aware of, is that the Hindu Mahasabha also had their version. And people listening might be a little surprised to hear what was in that constitution. Can you tell us what were the main features?
Yeah, so the constitution of the Hindustan Free State was drafted by a committee appointed by the Hindu Mahasabha, and its inspiration was Savarkar. Savarkar had been president of the Mahasabha for 6 continuous years from 38 to 44 or 45. And he had said in the Hindu Mahasabha session in Calcutta that the Hindu Mahasabha needs to draft a constitution because it needs to be as a serious party in the Indian political scenario. And at that point of time, after the resignation of the Congress government in Bengal on account of the Second World War, the Hindu Mahasabha in an alliance was in power in Bengal. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee was a minister in Bengal at that time. So taking inspiration from that, the constitution of the Hindustan Free State was drafted. So I think there is one overriding feature that is interesting about the constitution, is that the constitution was fairly cosmopolitan, because we tend to think that the constitution of Hindu Mahasabha will be indigenous and Indic and will be rooted. But it was not any of that. It was in that sense as colonial as the Constitution of India, the same kinds of ideas of a very big state, towering over the citizens, colonial institutions, large center, all that kind of ideas there. But there's also a very heady cosmopolitanism. The name itself is Hindustan Free State. The idea of a free state comes from Ireland, because Savarkar was a great admirer of what Ireland had done in its anti-colonial struggles against England. The Irish state was called the Irish Free State. And so they decided to name the constitution of the Hindustan Free State. 2, there were 3 key features which would be interesting for your listeners, because this is the only known instance of any party from the Sangh Parivar having drafted a constitution. This is no guarantee of what will happen in the future, but if the past is any indication, it should certainly guide. They said that there shall be no state religion in India. Savarkar was also an atheist. He was very well known as being an atheist. So if the Hindu Mahasabha constitution had become the law of the land, then there couldn't have been a constitutional Hindu Rashtra. Number one. Number two is that there was equal citizenship for all. So there would be no law that could discriminate on the basis of religion. Number three is that minority religions were given protection of culture, language, and script, and could also have recourse to state funds if the majority religion also had recourse to state funds. So it was maybe giving religion a more prominent place in the public sphere than the Constitution of India did.
Let me stop you there, Arghya, and ask you, didn't that result in any pushback? Because one of the key ideas of Savarkar's thing was that this was, as you write in the book, that this land was both Pitrabhumi and Punyabhumi. It had to be, and in that sense, that's how you defined somebody as Indian, as part of this. And the whole premise was that Muslims and Christians, for them it was Pitrabhumi because they were born here and their forefathers were born here, but it was not Punyabhumi because their holy land lay outside these borders. So did they just quietly drop that proviso?
No. So actually, this is a very, very important question because it does appear like a contradiction of immense proportion. That on the one hand, you're writing that India is a land of Hindus, that is people who have their Pitrabhumi and Punyabhumi in India. And on the other, you're saying there's equal citizenship. And I think this is very critical to understand even for the modern day, that the Hindutva doctrine always operated at a sphere that is parallel to constitution and government, and that is society. So in Savarkar's head, there was no contradiction because that was going to happen in society. Whereas as far as the constitution is concerned, this was a land that it had opened its doors to everyone and everyone could reside here, provided we make the constitution. You can see shades of this through the course of independent India, where Hindutva doctrine has operated side by side with a very reasonable constitutional language being spoken by the adherents of the Hindutva doctrine. And we see this today as well, that the Prime Minister thinks of the Constitution as a book that he worships and he needs to take seriously. And this does not in any way detract from any philosophical idea of Hindutva because that operates in the sphere of society. This often operates in the sphere of law and politics. So I think that's one point about Savarkar. But I think the other point is that what is the political subtext of the Constitution, this Constitution being drafted? And I think it's important to understand that. Is that one, is that the Hindu Mahasabha wants to be seen as a reasonable centrist party. And it feels that a reasonable centrist constitution is the way to do that. What? And why does it want to be seen as that? Because it's getting outflanked by the newly emergent and popular Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. The RSS was becoming the party of Hindus, but the RSS was not interested in constitutional discussions. In fact, Hedgewar keeps them very steadfastly away from these kinds of political discussions. They have said that their mission is a socio-cultural revival of Hindus. It's not interested in the constitution. So the Hindu Mahasabha is being outflanked on the ground by the RSS. This is a space that it can occupy, and so it chooses a space which is very different from the RSS.
Now, to get back to the constitution that we ended up having, despite all the inspiration it gets from America, Ireland, France, and all of that, and the Government of India Act that it's its basis, you write that, Ambedkar had this theoretical framing that all these rights, including the right to a free election without a full belly, would be a mockery. So economic rights were a big part of the discussion, were heavy on the minds of the framers of the Constitution. Yet explain what happened to them. Why did they not become enforceable rights?
Because I think the short answer is the lawyers won the day.
They said it was too expensive.
Yeah, it's too expensive because you can't promise economic rights because how will the state pay for it? Because it was felt that if you were to say that everyone has a right to food and shelter, then if that means that the state has to, if someone can go to court and say that I want my right to food, then how will the state pay for it? And this is very traditional legalistic thinking. Legal thinking has evolved over the course of the last 75 years. And The right to food doesn't necessarily, as we know, doesn't necessarily mean that every person has to be given a meal. The right to food could be a right to a scheme by which you can get food. So it doesn't have to be a direct entitlement to that material good, but could be the entitlement to a program, something of that kind. But the point is that the lawyers win the day. And the lawyers win the day, and so Ambedkar, at that point of time, as in picks his battles and decides that, okay, a good way to do this is to have them as directive principles of state policy, which means that governments should do their utmost to try and ensure that these economic rights are fulfilled. But if they can't, people can't go to court. And this is, I understand.
And this also comes from somewhere, Ireland, or no?
Yeah, so this idea of directive principles comes from Ireland, as we are told from our civics textbooks. The actual principles themselves are a kind of mishmash. As in, we have some from India, which is essentially these Gandhian ideas which have no place. So, for example, prohibition or village government or prevention of cow slaughter. These ideas come in from India, from our lived experience. B.N. Rao adds a few, respect for international law. Then there are some which come from an ILO declaration in relation to labor. There are some that come from Ireland. So it kind of comes from all over. And it's a very interesting and cosmopolitan mix of things that we put in there. I mean, if you want to be charitable, you will say that. If you want to be uncharitable, as was said in the Constituent Assembly by T.T. Krishnamachari, it's a dustbin of sentiment. This is a real shame because the original idea was that these were going to be economic entitlements. So there was a slide from economic entitlements to economic directives. There was a further slide from the economic directives to social directives. And there was a final slide from social directives to any directives that anyone feels, right? So that's the slide. And I think that there is a lost opportunity there because if we weren't so small c conservative in our thinking at that point of time and didn't think of the question of economic rights as merely a legalistic question of justiciability, but rather thought of it as a policy question of duties of the state, then I think we would have gotten somewhere. So if I were to give an example, we were talking about education at that point of time in the Constituent Assembly quite a bit because education was important. So the compromise that was worked out is that we can't put education as a right, again, because we don't have money, but it should become a right in 10 years. This was the compromise that was worked out in the Constitution. But I wish that if instead of thinking in that way, that, it will become a right, what if we thought differently? What if we thought that what is it that is needed to get every child in school? What is needed is A, money, 2, you need buildings, 3, you need teachers, 4, you need textbooks. And then if you were to think about how you're going to provide all this, okay, and what kind of scheme you can set up. Now, our legal thinking is kind of revolts at these ideas because we don't think this is constitutional. We think this is a matter of some scheme. But if education is the most important thing in the country at that point of time, then why do we not think of it as something important enough to find significant place as something in the Constitution itself? And I think this, if we had more time and if the Constitution framers had the freedom, I'm sure they would have done that. And that's why I feel that every generation should think for itself in terms of what new constitutional ideas should we have.
These are some instances that you talk about in which sort of these radical ideas get diluted at the time of writing. So sitting in your capacity as part of Vidhi, would you say there were way too many lawyers involved in drafting the Constitution and needed some other people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there were a lot of lawyers involved in the freedom movement. So I think there was a kind of self-selection that happened. But this is a very deep view that continues to pervade society today, that the Constitution and laws is the stuff for lawyers and judges. And this, I think, is a misstatement of immense proportions. The Constitution is a political document. Every law is a political document. How that law is interpreted in court may also be political, but that may be the rightful remit of lawyers and judges. Okay, but the fact of what we want in a constitution, the fact about what we want in our laws, is certainly not a question for lawyers and judges. And I think that's where we need to break this mindset that we're coming up to a general election. Now, how many manifestos will seriously promise changes in law? Right? There will be very few. And even if there are going to be these standout headline laws that we all know about. Law is seen as operating in a different sphere. Ye to vakilo wali chi. As it's a different sphere from the sphere of government and day-to-day governance, which is very much about some kind of welfareism, some scheme, some building a road or a hospital. And I think that the roots of this lie very much in the freedom movement. Shruti Kapila has a very interesting piece where she talks about how the freedom movement and constitutional framing operated in parallel tracks and how kind of paradoxical that is. But I think those tracks were set then, that this is the track of the constitution and this is the track of government. And you find that Nehru and Patel and Azad, who are both in the Constituent Assembly as well as in the first cabinet, are running the country. They are doing the day-to-day, firefighting, whereas the constitution, is left to the lawyers, because the lawyers are not in that, rough and tumble of everyday politics. And I think that's the thinking that even with my book, I'm trying to change, is that the book is provocative because it wants people to have views about the constitution. And you may agree with it, you may disagree with it. That's a different point. But the fact is that every citizen should think for themselves about the constitution, because that's how we get a better constitution. Not by sort of, by saying that, it's this remote document that has to be venerated.
You live in Delhi. Do you hear, is there buzz behind, something like when many people read economist Bivek Debroy's piece where he said we should go back to the drawing board and start from first principles, asking what the words in the preamble mean now and all of that. Is there serious buzz around that the constitution needs to be overhauled, if not rewritten from first principles?
No, I think the buzz is only on Twitter.
But do you think, you keep saying, every generation needs to think about these things.
Yeah.
But what does that mean for you? Do you think we should go back to the drawing board?
And so I think that, as I've said in my book, in the epilogue, that we need to think of new constitutional ideas for India. And I do think that we need that. And this is no disrespect to the framers of the constitution at all. There has been a journey of 75 years. We have had the experience of democracy, what's and all, for 75 years. And we need to now factor that into our current experiences. And I personally would think of three things as projects that need to be taken up. Number one is that, as I said, we need to think about how we can get the third tier of government as a genuine tier of government. Because I don't think that Indians can grow if growth is contingent on a large state sitting in Delhi. I just don't think it's going to happen. We need to bring government closer to the people. Second, we do need to think about duties. I think otherwise we will see duties come in a form that we will not like. And I do think that there needs to be some serious work, including by legal scholars, in terms of how we think about duties and rights coexisting with each other in a modern framework. Third, we need to think about police reform. And I've said this ad nauseum, that we continue to have a police that is feared, that is not in the service of the people. And I think that we need to think about reforms that need to be made to these colonial institutions to make sure that they are appropriate for a 21st century democracy. These don't necessarily need to take the shape of a new constitution. That is a political call as to whether you have a new constitution or whether you have amendments to the existing one. But the point is that political call should not stop us as citizens from talking about it. I know the atmosphere that we are saying this in, and I know that it does evoke some fears, but we do have to talk about it, because if we don't engage with these issues, then these issues will come and bite us in a form that we don't.
But in the 1940s, when the Constitution was being written, and as you said, Gandhi saw it, he was less interested in the content as he was in the consensus that could be developed around it. Do these conversations also need a kind of consensus, and do you see that present right now?
Yeah, so I think that any constitution, if it has to be long-lasting, needs consensus. And there was a reason as to why Gandhi didn't push those ideas on that point. Right. And I think that at this point of time, unfortunately, it's a reality today that we are as far away from a consensual politics as perhaps we have ever been. There is some consensus you see on some issues like EBC reservation or judicial appointments or things like that. But these issues are few and far between. Okay. So I think that if there is going to be any kind of constitutional change, then there needs to be first a high degree of political statesmanship in order to make this happen. It was tried by Atal Bihari Vajpayee with the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution, headed by a very well-respected former Chief Justice Venkatacharya with some bipartisan composition. It was tried, but that too failed. So my sense is that this is always difficult at any point of time, even when, politics of a gentler time like the Vajpayee era, even then it was very, very difficult. So obviously it's going to be even more difficult now. And I'm not a politician, as I'm a citizen and I'm a lawyer. And I think it's our duty to continue talking about changes that India needs. And if we can push the narrative in a direction where the changes are sensible, then at some point of time, one can hope that there is a fair degree of consensus. Because what we know about consensus is that consensus takes time. And
because what many people fear is that the only time governments want to do something like that is not necessarily when they can build consensus, but when they have an overwhelming majority in parliament, where they feel then they can say we have the mandate to do this and don't necessarily need the consensus.
Yeah, so I think that, anything that comes out of that kind of process will not be long lasting. And I think history is testament to that. You can see the 42nd Amendment during Indira Gandhi's time, where there were widespread changes that are made to the Constitution, but it was made in such a draconian way that it created its own reaction. The Janata Party coming in and coming up with the 44th Amendment to undo most of those changes. So I think that, our politicians are wiser than we are, and I think they know all this. So I think that if there is a constitution or any radical change that comes out of this kind of thinking, that I have the mandate and so I can change it, maybe they may be able to change it, but it's not going to last.
Would a change to the name Bharat last?
Well, I don't even know whether that's a constitutional change in that sense, because I think the constitution, this is a nothing debate that has been created in my view. I'm a Bengali. When I'm speaking in Bangla, I say Bharat. When I'm speaking in English, I say India. I see the two as naturally coexisting with each other. And I think that it should continue to coexist. We should be able to use both names in their appropriate context. And I think that there is no need to replace one with the other. We should stop creating these binaries. We are India, we are Bharat, we are Hindustan, we are all these things. These are historical facts and all of them should coexist.
On that note, Arghya Sengupta, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandip. It was a real pleasure.
Arghya Sengupta is Research Director at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. His latest book is The Colonial Constitution. Send us your thoughts and ideas, colonial or post-colonial, wherever you get your podcasts from. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. Thanks as always for listening. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio, and Happy Republic Day.